welcome once again to the Explaining History podcast. And today I'm going to talk about the beginnings of the Blitz, the bombing campaign over Britain in 1940, which continued ultimately till 1943, but its most intense phase was 1942-41. In the speech by George VI to the British during the beginning of the Second World War, announcing that the country had gone to war, he makes the point of saying that war can no longer be confined to the battlefield. This was something that was well understood about the nature of the forthcoming conflict, in that the 1930s had seen the implementation of civilian bombing by Germany in Spain, by Italy in Abyssinia, and by the Japanese in China. All powers were obsessed with aerial bombing, and all powers were well aware of the consequences of aerial bombing. So whilst it was unknown what shape a land war against Nazi Germany would take, the war that everyone was really expecting in Britain was the Blitz. And it was the war that everyone in Britain was fearing and had feared since September 1939, when the declaration of war was announced. Now, the book that I'm reading from at the moment is Juliet Gardner's excellent history of the Blitz, entitled The Blitz, The British Under Attack. The other book that is well worth a read by Juliet Gardner, in fact everything she's written is well worth a read, but the 30s and Intimate History, really kind of her history of Britain in the 1930s really feeds into this story of the Blitz, the first phase of Britain's war. She starts with a famous quote by Stanley Baldwin, who said to the House of Commons in 1932, "I think it is well for the man on the street to realise that there is no power on earth that can prevent him from being bombed. Whatever people may tell him, the bomber will always get through. The only defence is offence, which means that you have to kill more women and children more quickly than the enemy if you want to save yourselves." And there Baldwin was making the case for a renewed investment in British air power and the development of the means of waging air war offensively, which is what Britain does eventually far more successfully than Germany, which with large fleets of 4-engine bombers that would devastate Germany's cities. But that is ahead of us. Now we're going to look at the air war by Germany against Britain. And this will be the first of several podcasts on the Blitz, because looking at questions such as evacuation and life for civilians under the Blitz is really very broad topic. So we're going to cover this bit by bit, take our time. Historians regard Saturday, September the 7th, 1940 as the first day of the Blitz, and obviously by this time the war has been ongoing for a year and a week. The Battle of Britain has by and large all but come to an end, and it has been concluded in the German Air Force and other services, and in the mind of Hitler as well, that the project to invade Great Britain, always a second fiddle idea, really has to be put on the back burner indefinitely. There was by September a degree of complacency that had set in. The British public had long since stopped clutching their gas masks, as the apocalyptic attack using poison gas that was forecasted never materialises. Air raid shelters fall into disuse, and some fill up with rainwater and rubbish and that sort of thing. And there are no more air raid patrol wardens being recruited, as many volunteers have very little to do, spend a lot of their time drinking cups of tea, smoking cigarettes, and generally feeling frustrated about the lack of any actual real purpose, except for complaining about blackout curtains and criticising members of the public for having their lights on at night. Evacuees who had joined the government's evacuation scheme came back home by January 1940 believing that there would be no mass bombing, that the whole thing was an exaggeration, and that there was no immediate threat to them and their families. Tragically, some who came back would be killed in the Blitz, unfortunately. However, Dunkirk, which I've talked about at length in the last few podcasts, Dunkirk seemed to have a galvanising effect on the public mood. There is a quote here in Juliet Gardner's book with one of her eyewitnesses who said, I remember at the Sainsbury's where I worked, somebody coming into the warehouse with an almost with satisfaction rubbing his hands together and saying, this is on hearing the news of Dunkirk, well, we're on our way now. There was a feeling that we were in the war now, that a certain feeling of resolve about it. Dunkirk had its effect. There were Churchill speeches, we will fight on the beaches and we'll never surrender, and very quickly daytime air raid warnings started. Again, there was this curious thing, just like at the beginning of the war. We expected the worst, and it didn't happen like that. We started getting air raid warnings by day and night. Sainsbury's agreed with other shops round about they wouldn't put up shutters immediately, but nothing happened. The people didn't go home. They stayed in the streets, so the gentleman's agreement between the shopkeepers was dropped, and the shop started to open again, even when the air raid warnings went, and life went on through the summer, but things were getting nearer. So from this oral account, what we can conclude is that the period of the phony war that lasted until the spring of 1940 was actually quite bad for British civilian morale because of the sense of uncertainty. Once it was clear that there would be fighting to do and the civilian population would bear the brunt of that, that actually does far more to galvanise the public around the idea of war than a sense of indecisiveness, of uncertainty as to whether a war is being waged at all. In a previous podcast, we talked about how the Battle of Britain came to an unsatisfactory ending for Germany, particularly for Reich Marshal Hermann Goering, Air Minister and Commander-in-Chief of the German Air Force. His poor intelligence that assumed that Fighter Command was defeated, and his desire to attack London in the hope that this would draw RAF planes to the city where they could be destroyed, resulted, as we know, on the 21st of August, against Hitler's orders, on the first bombing of London. The fact of the matter is that this was probably an error, but it offered Churchill a propaganda victory. It gave Churchill the opportunity to speak in Parliament about air raids over Berlin, which commenced. And on September the 2nd, Goering decided that it was time for the Luftwaffe to switch to bombing Britain's industrial and administrative centres and transport hubs and communication links. And the strategy that the German Navy advocated of blockading Britain's ports continued. The decision to take the pressure away from the RAF's airfields gave the RAF time to repair, rebuild and re-equip. They only needed a matter of days, and so the Battle of Britain began to transition into the Blitz. We haven't really seen the beginning of the Blitz yet because Goering was still attempting to wage the Battle of Britain in order to wear the British down using aerial bombing over these new targets instead of the airfields as a prelude to an invasion. Once we're in the Blitz, it's not about the possibility of invasion any longer. The whole point of the Blitz isn't to create circumstances to invade Great Britain, but to destroy civilian morale to the extent that the British public will beg for appeasement and will get rid of Churchill, and that will be the next manner in which Hitler will remove the thorn in his side of Great Britain. On September the 4th, Hitler said to the Berlin Sports Palace, where the Nazis preferred to call grand rallies for support of wartime policy, he said, "The British will understand now, as night after night we give them the answer to RAF bombing raids, he was saying. When they declare they will attack our towns on a large scale, then we will erase theirs. 3 days later, Hermann Goering spoke on the radio. He said, I now want to take this opportunity of speaking to you to say this moment is a historic one. As a result of the provocative attacks, British attacks, on Berlin in recent nights, the Führer has decided to order a mighty blow to be struck in revenge against the capital of the British Empire. I personally have assumed the leadership of this attack, and today I hear above me the roaring of victorious German squadrons which now, for the first time, are driving towards the heart of the enemy in full daylight, accompanied by countless fighter squadrons. After he made that speech, he headed to the Channel Coast, where he and other Luftwaffe commanders stood with their binoculars, trained across the Channel, looking at Britain, watching German aircraft fly in formation across the Channel towards London. One eyewitness, the journalist Virginia Cowles, saw the planes come over, and the noise that got louder and louder she described as like the faraway thunder of a giant waterfall. She writes, We lay on the grass, our eyes strained towards the sky. We made out a batch of tiny white specks, like clouds of insects moving northwest in the direction of the capital. Some of them, the bombers, were flying in even formation, while the fighters swarmed protectively around. During the next hour, we counted over 150 planes. They were not meeting any resistance. At 4:43, air raid sirens sounded across London. Though at first there had been so many false alarms that people took little notice, and one eyewitness, the psychologist Anthony Weymouth, wrote that people are becoming quite used to these interruptions. I do not think that the drone in the sky means death to many people at the moment. It seems so incredible as I sit here at my window, looking out on the fuchsias and zinnias with yellow butterflies playing around each other, that in a few seconds I may see other butterflies circling in the intent of murdering each other. It might be that this form of warfare, of mass aerial attacks on civilian targets, which was relatively new to, well, certainly completely new to people in Great Britain, but relatively new to the world population in general, was part of the cause of this sort of sense of unreality. Normally, when armies meet one another in the field, there is a knowledge that in the not too distant future, that there will be an immense amount of chaos and violence, and people will be dying. When war impinges upon the well-constructed everyday that humanity manages to kind of build for itself within the urban environment and within sort of the civilian world, it is kind of a fantastical and other notion, and therefore it makes sense that it was greeted with that sense of unreality. The purpose of this first attack, as listed by the commands to the 1st Fliegerkorps that afternoon, were to force English fighters into the air so that they will have reached the end of their endurance at the time of the main attack. This was to achieve maximum effect. It is essential that units fly as a highly concentrated force. The main objective of the operation is to prove that the Luftwaffe can achieve this. The first target of the day was, and the first target of the Blitz in general, was London's docks that lay in the east end of London. And docks would feature as major front lines in the Blitz in London, Bristol, Cardiff, Swansea, Liverpool, and other port cities. And this is perhaps why, when the oral histories of the Blitz are told, they're very often working class histories, and histories of working class communities banding together. Why? Because that's where working class people lived, or that is where the working class people would have lived near the docks because of the proximity of dockers' homes to the dockside. Certainly, where I'm talking to you from today, here in Cardiff in the UK, a vast swathe of the west side of the city, from the docks all the way through to the edges of the city centre, were working class tenement homes in the 19th century and the early 20th century, built there really to make sure that there was a sufficient labour force for the biggest coal port in the world. And the tragedy of it as well, is that in the part of London known as Silvertown, where the docks were at that point, the workers' houses would be cheek by jowl with warehouses and docks themselves. So there was no delineation between where the workers lived and where the main strategic and industrial targets were. Bombs fell on the Ford Motorworks at Dagenham and hit the Beckton Gasworks, which are the largest gasworks in Europe. The three royal docks at Woolwich Reach were hit with bombs. These were stores with foodstuffs and materials for the war effort, and were ablaze within minutes. And the huge importations of timber from the USA, 200 acres of timber at Surrey commercial docks went up in flame, and distilleries, soap works, warehouses housing rum from the West Indies, a rubber factory, and the gasworks were all hit, damaged, causing huge fires. And there was a fear. I mean, some of this stuff that was burning, stuff like rubber and pitch and natural gas, led to the anxiety and panic that the Germans were dropping poison gas, which actually they weren't doing. And of course, all of this pushed the fire services to the very edge. Incendiary bombs were dropping across the docks, lighting wood which had sat through one of the most driest and hottest summers on record, that was ready to go up like kindling. The fire services were joined by the wartime auxiliary fire service substations on the docks, and the engines that they took with them were often drawn by civilian vehicles, vans, taxis, and anything that could be commandeered and had been commandeered at the start of the war. The drivers, often inexperienced and untrained in dealing with fire, having to come along as part of the package. There was literally nothing that Britain could have done to prepare itself in terms of firefighting for the scale of the task that came ahead. And in this new kind of war, this new type of offensive, new methods of dealing with fire and civilian rescue would have to be learned on the job. The Auxiliary Fire Service had begun recruiting in March 1938, and after the Munich crisis expanded dramatically when it became abundantly clear that war was coming one way or another, and it would be an air war against Great Britain. Posters were dotted around London saying, "Keep the home fires from burning," an inversion of the Ivor Novello song that was popular during the First World War. And there were 15 auxiliaries for every one fireman by the time war broke out in September 1939. None of the firefighters had dealt with fires of the scale and intensity that the first day of the Blitz would create, particularly in the wood stacks of East London that we previously mentioned. Juliet Gardner writes, "Now it seemed that all the drill they had carefully learned was for another world. As soon as they trained their hoses on one outbreak, another flared up feet away. Damped down by the water jets, a pile of wood would sizzle in the heat, then burst into flame again. The firemen worked so fast to screw together the sections of hose and run them into the river, so that there was no shortage of water, but soon telegraph poles all around the docks were combusting with heat, and even the wooden blocks that surfaced the roads were igniting. Grains spilling out of the warehouse made a sticky mess in the firemen's boots, bogging them down as if they were walking through treacle in some sort of nightmare." By 6:30 that evening, the Luftwaffe had returned back to the air bases across the Channel, and it seemed as if all was over, but this was but the lull. The pattern that was set for the next 8 months would be the Luftwaffe's first wave would drop incendiary bombs to start fires. The blazes would then act as beacons to guide in subsequent formations of bombers with their high explosive loads, and it would tie up the civil defence services so that the fire, rescue, and medical hospitals would be inundated already, and so that they wouldn't be ready for the real onslaught when it came. At 8:30, the sirens wailed again, and the raid would continue until dawn. This added more chaos and devastation to the East End, which was the target again. But bombers spread out across the north side of the river, further westwards, bombing Chelsea and Victoria on that night as well. But the docks themselves, the Isle of Dogs, Silvertown, Rotherhithe, along with Bermondsey, Canning Town, Woolwich, and Deptford, were hit. West Ham, Plaistow, Bow, Whitechapel, Stepney, and Poplar were also bombed. And the total number of German bombers, Heinkels and Dorniers, was 250 on that particular attack, coming in waves to drop high explosives on the wharfs and the ruined houses and the devastated streets and communities around them. Local fire control centres sent out auxiliary fire service riders on motorcycles to scout the streets to find out the most serious concentrations of fire so that they could organise their forces adequately. Fire engines raced across the east end of the city, bells ringing. When fires were designated as conflagrations, where they start to meet up and connect and burn out of control and move rapidly, the urgent need of fire engines was allocated to those kinds of blazes. Surrey Docks was a square mile of blaze by the midnight. Cranes, steel cranes, buckled under the intensity of the heat and collapsed into the river, and paint on the fireboats attempting to put out the fire began to blister in the heat. At the Royal Arsenal in Woolwich, many of the buildings that had been there for generations burned, and they were packed with live ammunition and high explosives. By the end of that first night of the Blitz, 625 tons of high explosive bombs and 800 incendiary bombs had been dropped on London from, as I said, 250 aircraft. There had been 1,000 fire engines fighting the blaze at the Surrey Docks, 300 pumps, and 1,000 men trying to contain one of the largest of the fires alone. By dawn, the initiation, the baptism of fire, quite literally, for the firemen after the first night of the Blitz, had taken its toll. There were men with blackened faces, physically and mentally exhausted, burning lungs from dust and smoke, whose eyes stung and were hungry, thirsty, and physically and mentally exhausted. One AFS man who was sent to Beckton Gasworks said, "Chaos met our eyes. Gasometers were punctured and blazing away. A powerhouse had been struck, rendering useless the hydraulic hydrant supply. The overhead gantry bearing lines of trucks communicating with the railway siding was also alight. And then, overhead, we heard German planes. The searchlights searching the sky in a vain effort to locate them. Guns started firing, and then I had my first experience of a bomb explosion. A weird whistling sound, and I ducked behind the pump with two other members of the crew. The others, scattered as we were, had thrown themselves down wherever they happened to be. Then a vivid flash of flame, a column of earth and debris flying in the air, and the ground heaved. I was thrown violently against the side of the appliance. After a time, things quietened down, and we went out again. It was now about 10 o'clock, and the fire had been burning and attacked by us for a lack of water, when a local fire officer arrived and informed us that he knew where we could obtain a supply. Our heavy was sent about half a mile from the fire to pick up water from 3 other pumps which were being supplied from hydrants. We relayed the water through a chain of pumps to the fire, and then there was nothing to do except watch the hose and guard where it crossed an arterial road. So we had to look round. What a sight! About a mile to our right was the riverfront. The whole horizon on that side was a sheet of flame. The entire docks were on fire. On all other sides it was much the same. Fire everywhere. The sky was a vivid orange glow, and all the time the whole area was being mercilessly bombed. The road shuddered with the explosions. Anti-aircraft shells were bursting overhead. Our Royal Navy destroyer berthed in one of our docks was firing her AA equipment, as were the ships. The shrapnel literally rained down. It was now about midnight, and still the racket kept on. It surprised me how quickly one got used to sensing whether a bomb was coming our way or not. At first we all lay flat every time we heard anything, but after an hour or so we only dived for it as one came particularly close. At 3 a.m. a canteen van arrived and served us tea and sandwiches. It was the first bite any of us had had since midday the day before, 14.5 hours ago. Just then the bombing became more severe and localised. A bright glow in the sky immediately over us, and we saw the flames. Another fire had started in the gasworks, which by now, after 6 hours concentrated work by us, had been got well under control. Then a huge mushroom of flame shot in the air from the docks, followed by a dull roar. An oil container had exploded. The whole atmosphere became terrible again with the noise of gunfire. Afterwards, when London established its famous anti-aircraft barrage, we got used to it. But on that first night, it was just hell. Okay, so I'll be continuing looking at this in the next few weeks or so stay tuned and we'll go further into looking at how British society changed as a result of the Blitz. I hope you found this useful. If you like this, give us a good review on iTunes. The more good feedback we get, the more this kind of content we can put out. And also, if you can check out our Patreon page, that would be grand too. Thanks very much. All the best. Bye-bye.